All right, folks. Hopefully everybody can hear me. And in a second, you'll see my screen as soon as I remember how to use Zoom. There we go. Let's try this. There we go. I need to swap that. Okay. All right, so everybody should be able to see my screen now. So thank you, Erica, and thank you guys for signing on this evening. What I want to do today is basically just go over a few points to consider for pasture management this spring, and then also get your wheels turning about some things to think about for later on in the season as well, just to have it on your radar. So what I'm going to do is basically go through these 5 points. If you guys have questions as we go along, feel free to type them in the chat and we'll answer them as we go, or save them till the end, either way. But what I'm going to talk about is first stand assessment and sort of get you thinking about what your plans are for your pastures. Then we're going to talk about fertility, spring fertility in particular. And then also I'm going to touch on a little bit about some other fertility considerations later on in the year as well. Talk about grazing management, especially with the spring flush of vegetation that we get. I'm going to talk about weeds for a little bit. It's not a weed talk, but of course, they're always something that's a problem in pastures. And then a few final points to be preparing for the summer and the fall. So that's what we're going to do. So first off, stand assessment. This is something to do really right about now, as your pastures are greening up, just to get a handle on basically how much plant cover you have, and are the plants that are present, are they desirable species? Are they going to produce good forage? Just to get a handle on, is this a pasture that you want to keep and maintain, or is this something that you need to start to think about renovating that pasture either this fall or in the following year? So I want to touch about how to do that. But before I get into that, basically what you're looking for is to determine, do you have enough desirable forage in that pasture, to meet your needs? And from a conservation and just best management practices standpoint, you want your pastures to have at least 70% coverage of some sort of plants. Preferably they would be forages, but something to anchor that soil and to keep your topsoil there and your nutrients there. So you want at least 70% plant matter there. And again, ideally, that's going to be desirable forage species. So how do you go about doing this? Basically, what you want to do is take a series of random samples or assessments in a pasture. And you can break this up by pasture, you can break this up by paddock, however makes sense for you to do it that way. But basically, here's our imaginary pasture here. It's in this lime green color. But basically what you want to do is sort of travel along your pasture in a zigzag sort of manner. And at random points along this transect, basically, you're going to assess what is basically under your foot at that point. There's ways you want to be random about this. You don't want to be, have any sort of bias to how you're sampling this. So it could be a little bit tricky to think about how you're doing this, but there are a couple of different ways to do this. Penn State, for example, they've developed basically they have a Frisbee, looks like this. This Frisbee has a little mark on it. And basically as you're zigzagging your pasture, you throw this out. And wherever it lands, that's your random spot that you're going to take a measurement and determine what's there. So in this case here, this Frisbee landed right here. And whatever this plant is or object or what have you that's right by this point, you're going to record that. In this case, this is a grass, so that's a desirable forage species more than likely. So that would be put in your table. So you could set a table up similar to this. I just sort of put different categories here. I like to break it up into desirable grass species as one category, legumes as another category. So things like clover or alfalfa, if you have alfalfa. Any type of weed species, this could be broadleaf weeds or grass weeds. Bare ground is another category because you're certainly going to come across bare ground or rocks, things like that. And then as a final category, you can put like old decaying plant material. It's not bare ground and it's not a weed or it's not desirable grass. Maybe it's just decaying plant material. So what you're going to do is, just go and do these 15 random spots in your pasture. I'd say do at least 15, preferably like 20, 25 to get a good sample. So you come across that point and whatever is at that random point, you're going to record what it was. So that's what I've done here, just as an example. Another way you can do it is you can use you can really just use your boot, as you're walking randomly, don't look down, look at the horizon and take some random set of paces along your zigzag transect and stop, say every, 100 paces or whatever. And just look at what is on the very tip of your left boot, for example, and record that as your measurement or your observation. So in this case here, what's on the very tip of this looks like some sort of forage grass. Okay. Whereas if we landed up here, we would have landed, and that would have been recorded as a legume because that's alfalfa. So just do that and get some sort of a sample here, at least 15, preferably 20 or 25, and see what your percentages are. So I just did the math here. So for example, in this random example I did, it is approximately 47% desirable grass species, 20% legumes, 20% weeds, 13% was bare ground, and none was this plant material. So in this particular pasture, we're looking at 87% total coverage. So that's good. About 67 to 70% is desirable forage species. So that's pretty good. And once you start falling below, and getting closer to 50% that are just forage species, then you probably want to consider methods to either rejuvenate that pasture with overseeding or starting over completely and renovating it. So now's a good time to do this before everything gets too overgrown. If you wait and do this at, the beginning of May, you're going to have a heck of a mess with really tall plants. So it's best to do this now rather than later. So once you've done that, you can start to think about fertility and what you're going to do as far as fertilizing your pastures. Of course, you guys have heard this over and over again, but just to reiterate, soil test, soil test, soil test. If you don't have a soil test, then you're just guessing. So if you don't have a test on hand that's, at least less than 3 years old, get a new sample. You can do that now. You can send it to the lab and get a result back in probably, 5 days to a week or week and a half. So you can do that now, even if you don't have any on hand. And you want to pay attention to things like your soil pH. Do you need lime? Now our soils tend to be acidic in this region with time. So, it doesn't matter what you do. Eventually, you're probably going to need lime added to your fields. So that's something to look out for. And then this soil test is also going to serve as a baseline for your nutrient recommendations for things like phosphorus and potassium. So how much fertilizer do you need? And that's going to be based off of your soil test. And as far as determining how much you need, if you're in Maryland and you have a nutrient management plan, certainly follow those recommendations. If you're outside of Maryland, or if you don't have a nutrient management plan, at least at the bare minimum, follow the recommendations that are provided by the soil lab. They're going to be good recommendations. They're going to be pretty close to what we would recommend anyway from University of Maryland. So I just went online and I pulled off a a sample soil test report from Waypoint. Any of the labs you're going to get similar information from, but this is just one that was easy to pull off. So when I get a soil report, a few things that I look at, the number one thing I look at is going to be pH. So for sure, pay attention to pH. For pastures and our forage species that we're growing, if you're in that 6 to 7 range, you're good for the most part. So you want to maintain pHs in there. So for example, these first two pastures are in that good zone, and then these bottom 3 are getting to be marginal. They're below 6. So they're definitely going to be fields or pastures that you're going to want to consider lime applications. The other things you're going to pay attention to are going to be your nutrient levels. So for this soil report, they're giving us phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. Phosphorus, for sure, pay attention to the phosphorus. For example, this field here, this first field is in the low category. So that's probably going to call for a phosphorus recommendation for fertilizer. Whereas say this third field is going to be in that sufficient range. So that's probably not going to need any phosphorus fertilizer in that. So pay attention to your phosphorus levels and the recommendations that are coming out of that, as well as potassium. So potassium is a big one that we often forget about, and I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit more later. But definitely don't underestimate the utility of a soils report. So get that in hand so you can spend your money wisely. As far as pH goes, I just want to go back to this. Before you invest money in fertilizer, definitely put your money into adjusting the pH first. If money is an issue, get your pH fixed first before you start adding fertilizer. That's going to be a better investment than just throwing fertilizer on there without adjusting the pH. So I do have a couple of general sort of comments about nitrogen for grass pastures. So keep in mind, these are general recommendations. That's why they're in air quotes for grass pastures, cool season grass pastures. I want to reiterate that you should definitely follow your nutrient management plan. So these are just approximations, but generally in our cool season grass pastures in our region, they're probably going to call for anywhere between 150 and 250 pounds of nitrogen for that year. And the recommendation is going to be to split apply that nitrogen. So you don't want to put 250 pounds of nitrogen on, in March or April, because you're probably only going to get to use about 50 pounds of it, and the other 200 pounds of it is going to go, down the river or into groundwater. So we really need to try to split our applications up. So typically what that's going to look like, again, they're going to vary a little bit, but it's going to be somewhere in the range of about 50 pounds of nitrogen that it would go on at green up. So when is green up? Green up is usually around mid to late March. We're just I'm in Harford County right now, Harford County, Maryland. We're about a week and a half past what would be the typical green up stage or so for us right now. But still, it's not too late to put on nitrogen application at green up for us right now. The second application of about 50 pounds would go in after what I put as first cutting or first clipping or first harvest in the spring. So if this is a hay field, for example, this will be after you took the first cutting of hay off of, then you'd put that second shot of nitrogen on it. If this is a pasture, this is sort of going to be the point after you've sort of grazed those pastures over, to get over that spring hump of that spring flush of forage. So that's probably going to put you, somewhere around the first or second week of May. After those have been really grazed, and then that would be when your second application would come in. And then we don't really do anything in terms of fertility with nitrogen. until we get into the later parts of the year. So late summer is when you would want to put on additional nitrogen. These applications later in the year are very important because they're going to help the plant grow more roots, and those roots are going to help it over winter, and it's going to help your pastures persist longer, so you'll be able to keep those pastures productive for years and years. So these later applications are important. So think about, August, late August, early September timeframe, and then late fall. We're looking at, October or so. So I do have a graph that maybe makes it a little bit easier to understand. So this is sort of the growth curve of a cool season grass. So our cool season grasses grow in the cool season. So here in the mid-Atlantic, we have cooler temperatures in the spring and the fall. So they have a really huge peak of vegetative growth in the spring, where they're going to put on a lot of yield, basically. Anywhere from, they're going to start growing about the end of March or so, and they're going to then they're not going to taper off until it starts to get hot and dry. And for us, that's typically going to be sometime in June, when that peak, really starts to get down into this lower peak here. And then they're not going to pick back up until temperatures and get a little bit cooler in the fall. So it's going to be like late September, and then they're going to pick back up. And this peak in the fall is not as much as it is in the spring. However, where they're really peaking in growth is going to be below ground. So all these root systems that they're putting in. So in terms of fertility, this is approximately where we're trying to time our nitrogen applications, because we're trying to time it with the growth of the plant. Because I mentioned before, nitrogen does not stick around. It likes to go places. So we want to time it to where the plant needs it. And again, if you can't make 3 or 4 applications of nitrogen during the growing season, and you're trying to limit yourself to, consolidate to making 1 or 2 applications, the ones that are going to be more important are actually these fall ones. So if you had to limit yourself to 1 application, I'd do it, in September. All right. So keep that in mind. Fall is very important time for a cool season grass. So just to reiterate nitrogen, this is just a graphic of the nitrogen cycle. Just to reiterate the fact and the importance of splitting your nitrogen application is because, again, nitrogen goes places. It doesn't stay in one form for very long. It has this complex cycle. This is why soil labs don't test for nitrogen, is because, it just goes through so many different transformations. So that's why our nitrogen fertilization, our nitrogen fertility recommendations are based on yield and not based on fertility. So you can lose nitrogen through different processes. You can lose ammonium nitrogen through a process called volatilization, which is just that ammonium is converted to gas, and there it goes. It goes into the atmosphere. You can also lose nitrate nitrogen through leaching. So nitrate has a overall negative charge, and your soil also has an overall negative charge. And negative and negative don't attract. So basically, nitrogen can be lost via leaching down into groundwater. But nitrate nitrogen could also be converted into nitrogen gas, and it just float away into the atmosphere through denitrification. So a lot of different ways, just to reiterate and hopefully impress upon the fact that, nitrogen will be lost, and that's why we split apply our nitrogen. If you are using a urea form of nitrogen for your pastures, which is very common in our region, it is recommended to use our urease inhibitor. So that'll prevent this process here, volatilization of the ammonium. So there's several different commercial products, and a lot of our commercial ag service providers have these available to treat your urea. That'll help keep it there longer so you don't lose it and lose your money with it. So just a couple of points to consider there. So some other points about fertility, talking about the other nutrients like phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, and magnesium. So again, for phosphorus, again, follow your recommendations that were generated either from the soils lab or your nutrient management plan. Your recommendation for phosphorus is really going to be heavily dependent upon what is already existing in your soil. Some of our soils are phosphorus rich, some of our soils are phosphorus deprived. So it just depends. Same with potassium. Some soils have a lot more potassium-based clays in them, so you don't need as much potassium, and some soils are sandier and don't have as much potassium-based clays in them, so they require more potassium. So another thing I want to reiterate is that this is often a forgotten nutrient, especially in forages. Forages need a lot of potassium, and I mean a lot. So their potassium requirement is actually greater than their nitrogen requirement. All right. So, if you're in a potassium deficient soil, you might need as much as 400 pounds of potassium for that pasture, if you have like orchard grass, for example. So keep that in mind and pay attention to potassium. This is a table that I inserted from a fact sheet that just shows nutrient removal, basically the amount of each different nutrient in these different forage crops on a per ton basis. So if you look at something like orchard grass, a popular cool season grass for us, it contains about 50 pounds of nitrogen per ton, about 17 pounds of phosphorus, and then 62 pounds of K2S, so your potassium. So that's a lot. So if your yield goal is 4 tons to the acre or so, I mean, you're looking at almost 250 pounds of potassium. So people often forget about that. So pay attention to potassium and fertilize accordingly. I also put sulfur in here as one to potentially look out for. That's why there's a question mark on it. So sulfur can be a deficient nutrient. We're seeing being more and more deficient as as the years go on. We used to get a lot of sulfur for free in acid rain, and since we've cleaned up fossil fuel emissions, we don't get sulfur deposited back on the landscape through rain anymore. So we're starting to see sulfur deficiencies in a lot of things. Not super common in established pastures, but it can happen. So just be aware of that. And then finally, calcium and magnesium. So these are two nutrients that that the plant actually takes up very similarly. They can't really distinguish between calcium and magnesium. So it's important to have their balance correct. And the way you supply calcium and magnesium and adjust sort of the ratios is through lime. So some limestone is calcium carbonate, so that's obviously going to provide calcium, and some limestone is magnesium carbonate, which is obviously going to provide magnesium. So pay attention to your soil test levels in regard to calcium and magnesium. I'm not going to go into exactly what the numbers are, but you can help. You can consult with your local ag agent. We can help you out with that. But just be aware that if you are deficient or you need to correct their ratio, the way to do that is basically going to be through limestone. So let's talk about grazing management a little bit. So in the spring, again, going to be typically our highest forage yields is going to occur in the spring. So there's a huge spring flush. You can start to graze those fields when the when the soil's fit. It's not too muddy, obviously, and when those plants are about 6 inches tall. And you don't want to graze below 4 inches, or you never want to mow below 4 inches, really, even. I'll talk about that in a minute, but you can sort of start when they're 6 inches. and then take it down to 4 inches, and hopefully you'll have enough room and you can rotate so that you don't get below that 4 inches. But what is often a problem in the spring sometimes, especially with lower stocking densities, is that you may actually have excess forage during this time. So what to do with that excess, you know, you have to clip it somehow. So either mow it or mow it and bale it, and then you could obviously use that excess to feed later. Basically what you want to do is you want to avoid having anything go to seed. You really don't want your grass seed, your grass plants, your forage plants to go to seed, or any of your weeds to go to seed. So you want to keep everything in a vegetative state. So as far as grazing, I just want to emphasize, the overgrazing issue. So again, keep it around 4 inches, okay? And then you want to rotate your animals, if you can, back to a paddock, that's 8 or 10 inches tall, and then graze it again down to 4 inches. This graph on the right-hand side really, it shows the importance of the concept of take half, leave half. You may have heard that before. So, if we start grazing when this plant is 8 inches tall, we're going to graze it down to 4 inches. Reason that's so important is because if you only take half of the above ground material, so if you looked at here, 50% removal of the leaf material, the plant only has to cannibalize about 2 to 4% of its root system in order to push new growth. All right, so you're only sacrificing that small percentage. Now, if we took 60 or 70% of that above ground material, the plant really has to tap into its root reserves and cannibalize its roots to push out new growth. So if you do that, you're looking at 50 to 80% of the root system is gone. And that's the reason the pastures don't persist under, overgrazing situations. It's just because they have no root system. So just to reiterate, don't go below that 4 inches, take half, leave half concept. If you can get animals off pasture until those pastures are a sufficient height, that's what you want to do. Feeding hay and keeping them in the barn or a sacrifice area is what you want to do. Obviously, rotational grazing is a benefit if you can set it up on your farm, and then adjusting stocking rates and moving to pastures that are ready is the way to manage that. So the spring flush can be a little bit challenging, but if you have multiple paddocks, rotate them quickly in the spring and frequently. That's a good way to sort of keep ahead of just the excess of forage in some cases. And again, if you do have excess that you can use and save, do it by baling. And again, we want to avoid keeping your animals in a situation like this. Obviously, you don't want to have them out on pasture when it's a mess, if you can avoid it. So I want to touch on weeds here. So obviously there's a lot of different kind of weeds, and you can break them up into a lot of different type of categories. But for this, I broke them down into these 4 categories: winter annuals, summer annuals, perennials, and biennials. The ones that we're really going to be seeing right now and worried about in the spring are our winter annuals. So the winter annuals, their story starts in the fall last year. So they germinated from seed in the fall. They grew up a little bit. They're still itty bitty plants. They overwintered. And then once the temperatures warm up enough, they start to grow very rapidly, and then they'll flower in the spring and produce seed, and that seed will stay there until the fall, where they'll germinate and the cycle starts over again. So these are the ones that are going to be flushing right now. The best control for them is to clip them. So whether that's through grazing or mowing, just prevent them from setting hard seed. If you see flowers, get rid of them somehow. Mow them, graze them, pick them out with your hands or a weed whacker, whatever you have to do. If you see flowers, that's not a good thing. If you're open to using chemical controls, the way to control winter annuals is going to be applications in the fall when those plants are really small, or in the early spring, again, when they're small. So some of our common winter annual pasture weeds are things like this, which I'm sure folks have seen. So shepherd's purse here on the left. There's also pennycress, which looks very similar. This here is henbit and death nettle. Those guys come up right about now. You're starting to see these purple flowers, and then a little bit later, you'll start to see the yellow flowers of our mustards that you'll see here. So they're just common ones. And again, if you see flowers, that should be an indication that you need to do something to get rid of those flowers. Summer annuals, so their story starts in the late spring. So they basically germinate in the late spring once the soil temperatures warm up to about 50 or 60 degrees. And then they grow very rapidly in the summertime. They're adapted to the heat and the drought. And they'll start to flower and produce seed anywhere from midsummer through the fall. And again, the best way to control these guys is to keep them from flowering. So clipping them before they set that seed in the summer and fall. And then again, chemical control, depending on what the weed is, late spring to early summer to treat these guys. Again, this is where it's really important to know what weed you're trying to manage. And we can help you in extension with that if you're having trouble. That way you can sort of target your management better. So some of our common summer annual weeds in pastures are things like our pigweed species. So this is spiny pigweed and redroot pigweed. Jimson weed is another one that we see, and then nightshade on the right. There are also summer annual grass species. Every horse owner has seen foxtail before and hates it. Okay, so foxtail germinates right around mid-April or so. When the soil temperatures are about 50-ish degrees, 55 degrees is when this guy actually germinates, but we don't see it until it gets this big, in the summer. Same with crabgrass. Crabgrass germinates early in the spring. And this is Japanese stiltgrass here on the right. So all can be very problematic pasture weeds. Japanese stiltgrass being one that really prefers wetter areas. So that's more of an overall management issue with poorly drained soils. These two guys can be in productive soils or poorly drained soils as well. There are some chemical products that if you're interested to using those that can inhibit their germination and kill those plants as they're germinating. So if you're interested in that, Prowl H2O is one of them that works very well against foxtail and crabgrass. I do want to mention perennials just because if you have perennials, there's something you need to manage year round essentially, and for many years. They persist year to year. They don't come back from seed. However, they do produce seed, but they persist year to year. They come back from the roots, and they're really hard to control just because they have such extensive root systems usually. So this is a really blurry picture of Canada thistle. This is actually one plant. Okay, so this is one plant that's 1.5 years old, and you can see the really extensive root system that it has. So this is why it's so difficult to manage these types of plants. So the way to get rid of them is through repeated stressing, grazing, mowing, spraying, what have you, to repeatedly stress that plant to the point that it depletes all its reserves and dies. With perennials, for chemical control, usually the most effective time to manage them is going to be when they're in the bud stage. So just before they're starting to flower is usually when chemical control is most effective for them. But again, you have to identify the weed that you're trying to manage. So for our pastures, there's a lot of different common perennial species, one of them being buttercup, which is a real pain because it tolerates mowing even. Other things like milkweed, dogbane, chicory, dandelion, plantains, dock. So all of these are perennials that are going to require an overall good pasture management approach for several years in order to get them under control. Again, I just want to reiterate the fact that clipping should always be in your toolbox of things to do. So really, you always want to keep your plants in that vegetative growth stage, whether they're your forages or your weeds. You know, if you start to see them, if you start to see seed heads and flowers, that's not what you want to see. Okay, so in this instance, we have orchard grass that has went to seed. There is a little bit of a misconception with some folks that you should let your pasture species go to seed. That way it thickens the stand, but in reality, that doesn't work too well. You know, these forages, these species have been domesticated for so long, they've kind of lost their ability to self seed and reproduce. So that's not terribly effective with those. However, weeds are very good at proliferating and self-seeding themselves. So you can guarantee that there's also weed species in here that went to seed because we let that orchard grass go to seed. So the mower is a friend. So, you know, don't be afraid to mow your pastures, and that'll go a long way in keeping them healthy and managing weeds, just by keeping them in that vegetative growth stage. So I also want to talk about briefly, just to mention a couple of points for preparing for the summer and fall. So in the summer, we typically get this slump called the summer slump, where again, our cool season grass pastures are less productive because of the heat and drought. So you need to think about what you're going to do to address your forage needs in this period of time. So you're probably going to have to feed hay or some other or something else, or have additional space for pasture. You know, there's lots of different ways to manage this summer slump, but you got to have some sort of plan. Okay, just keeping animals out on pasture 24/7 is not a solution to the summer slump. Other things to consider as we get into summer and fall are again going to be your split applications of nitrogen. Especially important are going to be the ones that you do late in the summer. And then are you going to do anything as far as reseeding and renovating pastures? So that's something you need to really think about now so that you can be ready to do that in the late summer, early fall, when it's a good time to plant. So that is more or less what I had for you guys today. I do have this resource here that is on our extension website. It's a god awful link. So I'll paste it in the chat box for you, but it takes you to this right here, which is basically, it outlines pasture management with emphasis on equine folks, basically month by month. So just bulleted list of things to consider that can be helpful. So that's found at that link, which I will copy and paste in the chat box. So there we go. So let me go back to my presentation. All right, so you guys have that now in the chat box. So just a summary: fertility going to be very important, pH very important. Don't forget about split applying your nitrogen. Don't forget about your other nutrient needs, especially potassium. Think about how you're going to manage that spring flush. And don't let weeds take over. Your mower is your friend. And then just be preparing for summer and fall. So that's what I have for you guys today. And my contact info is here. You guys can certainly ask questions right now. Let me see if I can pull up my chat. Also, if you guys wouldn't mind, you can go to that link, go.umd.edu/teachag, to fill out a quick little teaching evaluation for me. It would be greatly appreciated. It's anonymous, so you can tell College Park that you liked me or hated me. Either way, just be honest. I think it's like 3 questions. So if you want to do that, that'd be great. Otherwise, I will take a question. So I do see a question here. So is aerating beneficial? So that's a very good question. So aerating your pasture can be beneficial in the sense that it will help. It'll help cycle nutrients a little bit better. It'll help with getting water infiltration better, trying to, especially in pastures that might be a little bit compacted because of hoof traffic, it can be beneficial to sort of loosen that thatch layer essentially, and to get more water down into that profile. So it can be certainly beneficial to do that. I don't see any other questions. So that's a good question. I don't have any other thoughts on that.
You want to unmute and ask a question?
So you guys can unmute yourself, I think. So if you have a question that way, you can do that. Let's see. So I don't see any other ones right now. So I think what I can share my slides with Erica. So if you guys want to have them, you can look at them if you'd like anytime. So let me see here.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Andy. I hope you guys enjoyed that presentation. There was a lot of information. And I have this recording, so I can send this out to everyone along with the slides as well. And feel free to reach out to Andy or I about any questions that you might have, later on, whenever. And hopefully you can come back and join us for the next 2 series. We have one on the 13th. We're going to talk about the spring vaccinations and talk about a little bit about the equine herpes virus that's kind of in full force right now, especially in Maryland. And then on the 27th, we're going to talk about creating a fly control program for your farm. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope to see you back next time. Thank you.